Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Today's conversation features jazz trumpeter Tatum Greenblatt. Something told me that Tatum would be a good person to talk to because he seems like such a comfortable professional musician, and also because he's such a sharp-dressed guy, and I just knew that there had to be something going on related to that. And boy, was I right. You know, the first thing that we talk about in the conversation is kind of why he dresses so sharp, and it turns out that that's very much part of his overall worldview, particularly his musical worldview. The way you present yourself, the way you approach the whole gestalt of being a musician is very important to him. He very quickly imparted the threefold tripod, three-legged monster of professionalism that was imparted to him by one of his early mentors, a saxophone player named Patience Higgins. Those are, number 1, be on time, number 2, be dressed right, and number 3, know the music. And, you know, he really has a professional point of view when it comes to being a musician. He's from a musical family, grew up in Seattle, Washington. His father, Dan Greenblatt, is a saxophone player and a highly regarded jazz educator. He had a few extremely significant early mentors. As I mentioned before, Patience Higgins, the saxophone player, was one of them. He also came out of an incredible middle school and high school experience in Seattle that has, over the years, turned out many, many great jazz musicians. From there, he moved to New York, and he became a student of Wynton Marsalis's as well. One of the things that I loved that he talked about was finding the balance between art and craft. He says, I've embraced the idea of being a professional craftsman trumpet player and finding my artistry within that. I dig that, you know. It doesn't draw a sharp line in the sand between when you're being an artist and when you're not. It allows you to bring your artistry to any gig. Although he prefaces it by saying it's a cliche, he says it's a cliche for a reason, that the study of music greatly increases your potential in terms of your success in life. He's had a number of recent prestigious gigs as a trumpet player. He plays regularly with the Mingus Big Band, also with Richard Bona, which I think is a very interesting gig. He's been this year on tour with the Roy Hargrove Big Band. Towards the end of the conversation, he does address some of the nuanced questions of being a young white guy, primarily on a black scene, and he handles that very carefully and very thoughtfully. As he says towards the end of our conversation, any information is good information. So I'd like to give you a little more information about him by way of this track from his most recent solo record. This is Gotta Feel It. I was thinking about this conversation before we got together today, and I was thinking about the first time that I really remember meeting you.
Mm-hmm.
It was about a year ago at a recording studio in Gowanus. We actually met before that.
We had, yeah.
But my memory of you is rolling up in the studio in, like, the sharpest suit. But I've actually seen you in a sharp suit on other occasions, too. I think you're a pretty sharp guy.
Oh, thank you. I certainly have caught the bug. Not as bad as others. I've actually recently seen what I could call a protege of mine, a young trumpet player from my hometown who moved to New York and called me when he got to town. And he was like, man, I want to learn how to dress like you. And so I was like, well, buy stuff that fits. And then he went on to roll with it and is now like featured in a book of dandies of New York City. And, so I'm not that bad, but I do appreciate a suit that fits.
Yeah.
With maybe some colors that match. Yes.
It seemed like when I moved to New York, I was expecting to see more sharp-dressed cats,
I shared that expectation, yeah.
And I was really surprised, particularly where you'd go to a gig and the band would look like they were the worst-dressed guys in the room.
Yeah, I think there's a particular sort of like anti-establishment strain that goes through that. I've actually had this conversation with my dad, who was coming of age in the 60s and 70s, and his whole thing was, man, we're not wearing suits because that's what the man wears. If you're a musician, you don't wear suits. And I think that there's there's now the other side of the reaction to that. I mean, you could see that in the bebop days, part of the idea was partly just that's what people wore, but the sharpness of the suit and the whole attitude of the jazz musician had something that all went hand in hand. And then I think it broke away from that as society in general became less formal. And I think you saw, especially with like the Wynton Marsalis era and on, as people starting to embrace that vibe of being a sharp-dressed cat and wearing a suit and looking clean and all that kind of stuff. And I think there's definitely a strain of us today where we, if we're all on the same gig, we'll kind of outdo each other a little bit,
I mean, Wynton, I think, is pretty well known for that kind of school of behavior, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And the way you look is a part of what you're presenting to an audience.
Sure.
You met Wynton when you were young.
Mm-hmm.
What was your first, connection to him like?
Well, my very first time that I met him was simply sort of as a young fan. I grew up in Seattle, and Jazz Lincoln Center came through when I was a sophomore in high school. And I went to go see them, and I had my Blood on the Field CD, and I waited. I was first in line for Wynton's autograph, like a young jazz nerd. And then I hung around the whole time, kind of just being around him. And, I mean, just the whole time that he was signing autographs, which he always does. He's always been good at that for his fans. I didn't really get to know him until 2 years later when I had come to New York to participate in the Essentially Ellington Festival, and I won a soloist award. So I had this chance to go meet him on stage and shake his hand and get an award and get the bro hug and everything. And then about a month later, Jazz Lincoln Center was back in Seattle for a concert. And so I had this sort of, there was this time sensitivity between when we had just had contact. So it was still close enough to that I felt comfortable approaching him on more of a student basis as opposed to just a fan basis. So they performed in Seattle, and then as it happened, there was a jam session at a club downtown that night. And because I had this recent connection through the Essentially Ellington thing, I went backstage and I talked to some of the guys that I had gotten to know, Marcus Printup and Wynton, and I said, hey, there's this jam session. Do you guys want to come? Which then led to my greatest entrance that I've ever made to anywhere in Seattle, which was showing up at a session as this 18-year-old just graduated senior with Wynton Marsalis in tow, and the whole the entire club turned and looked and gasped, and I got to be the person that brought him in.
Yeah.
It was great for my ego then. But I sort of parlayed that into a lesson while he was still in town the next day, which ended up involving no trumpet whatsoever. We just went out for sushi, and then he talked to me for 3 hours, which was amazing, and said, call me when you get to New York. So I called him when I got to New York, and things sort of led down the path of student-teacher relationship from there.
So your first lesson with him was actually to go have dinner?
Yeah. I went to the rehearsal that they had that afternoon before their concert, and there was about a 5-hour break. And we walked back to his hotel, and we went up to his suite, and I unpacked my trumpet, and he said, don't worry about that, I've already heard you play.
Yeah.
Let's go have some food. Where can we get some food around here? And we walked around, found a sushi place, and then we walked around some more. And he just sort of gave me, a laundry list of of advice and perspective about moving to New York and what it meant to be a young trumpet player and what he sort of expected out of youngsters and what he thought of other youngsters and people that he thought were living up to his expectations and people that he thought that weren't. And, it sort of left me with this sense of like, wow, man, I'm entering into some heavy shit here.
Yeah.
And he just said, call me when you get to town. And so when I moved to New York, I called him within the first week that I was here and went to his place. And again, we didn't play trumpet. We played basketball and I ate gumbo. So it took a while before I actually got a lesson with him, but that's sort of how our relationship developed. But I was actually really lucky to have a role model outside of Wynton, this great Reedus named Patience Higgins, who was my dad's teacher. They had met in the 70s, and my dad studied with him throughout his life. And every time Patience was in town with a show, he was traveling all the time. Anytime he was in town in Seattle on a gig, he'd stay with us.
Yeah.
And a lot of times he was in town doing Broadway shows. He was putting his daughter through medical school. So he just hit the road with the shows, and coming through Seattle, he could pocket the housing per diem, and he'd stay with us. And as it became clear that I was serious about music when I was a teenager, he, voluntarily took me under his wing in any way that he could, whether it would be lessons in improvisation when he would come to town, or just talking to me or showing me around, introducing me to people. But his whole career has been the workingest journeyman professional in New York City. I mean, he's famous for, as he says, gigging 8 nights a week. That's just what he does. He gave me the perspective of the musician who pays their rent on a regular basis, as opposed to the starving artist perspective, which is sort of what we glorify in moving to New York. Like, I'm going to get here and I'm going to be from, I'm doing this for my art, man. And the thing that he told me was, if you want to work in New York, the 3 most important things are, in order, be on time, be dressed right, know your music. Because in that's the order by which you'll be judged. Mm-hmm. You can show up and play your ass off, but if you're wearing the wrong clothes and you're late, you'll never get called again. Conversely, you can show up and not know the music, but if you're on time and you look good, the band leader still might call you back, because at least you're reliable and he knows he's got a butt on stage when he needs it. And you can sort of even be forgiven for not being musically up to the task if those other areas of your professionalism are up to task. And I think I was really lucky to have that perspective moving to New York, because then even as I was at the New School, in full like free jazz artistic exploration mode, when I would get called to do a senior recital, I'd be at the rehearsal on time, and everybody knew. I was able to develop a reputation for myself as somebody that could be reliable. And as that translated into the professional realm, I even heard that from guys that would call me to sub. I'd say, hey man, thanks for giving me all this work. And they'd say, thank you for being a reliable sub. I know if I call you, you'll be there and you'll do the job. So I got to give credit to, as much as Wynton was an influence in terms of helping shape my way of thinking about things, Patience was the one that was like, here's what you have to do if you want to get called.
Well, and even going back, I guess we skipped the really fundamental first thing, I would imagine, which is that your father's a musician and a jazz educator as well. So what was it like in the house?
Well, I think the greatest advantage that I got of many was just growing up with jazz being the music that was being played in the house. I mean, my mom also listened to great music, but that was like Los Lobos and the Gypsy Kings and stuff. And I have as much of an appreciation for the music that she was listening to, but I fell in love with jazz before I even knew that that's what had happened. It was just music.
Yeah.
I distinctly remember having a recognition of the fact that other people listened to other music. I was in like first grade, and I just remember realizing at some point that not everybody listens to Art Blakey. I started to wonder, like, what music do other people listen to? Wait, they don't listen to jazz. That's right. There's other music out there. So to have that foundation before I ever even started learning about music or ever became serious about it, to have, like, just Freddie Hubbard so deeply ingrained in my soul, just the sound of that was, the feel of a ride cymbal. Like, I never had to learn that. It was always basically, my dad would talk about, he's a linguist as well as a jazz guy, and he would talk about native language acquisition versus adult language acquisition, and that there's a point in your developmental cycle where your brain sort of switches off its ability to pick up naturally what your language is, which is what you see with immigrant families. Like, if you're 2 and you move to the States, you pick up, or 5 or whatever.
And your mother doesn't.
And the parents, they don't ever get it. So I had native language acquisition with jazz. So I was extremely lucky with that, given that was the profession I ended up going into. But beyond that, once I started getting serious about it, I had private lessons at home every day from arguably one of the best teachers around. I mean, he later moved here and he's got a, best-selling jazz method book and all this stuff. But at that point, it was just, sitting down and learning joy spring with my dad playing piano. And
You say that it was great that you had native language acquisition given that you chose to become a jazz musician, but I also wonder if the native language acquisition, the fact that you learned it so naturally, is the reason you became a jazz musician.
it sure helped in the process. I think when you gain an interest in something and then you realize that you're good at it, you become much more interested in it. And I'm sure that helped. And I know now looking back that part of the reason I liked playing trumpet so much when I was 12 is because I was good at it, and it's fun to be good at something. It all tied in. I mean, whether or not it was the sort of the ultimate fatalistic precursor and I never had a choice in the matter, I don't know. But it sure helped to have just this exposure to everything. And also to musicians themselves. I mean, I grew up with jam sessions happening in the house on a weekly basis, and just being around musicians and seeing these guys and being always having music happening, whether it was on a record or just live people having jam sessions and rehearsals or going to my dad's gigs. It was a part of my life from the very beginning.
And was it comfortable? Did you ever, you mentioned earlier on that your dad's generation was the one that kind of rebelled against wearing suits, and now here we are another generation later and you're putting suits on. Did any of that play out in the music and the way you wanted to approach learning the music? Did you feel like you wanted to claim something for your generation or for yourself?
Not so much, because in a way I sort of always had a leg up on my dad in terms of his relationship to music. He came to it as an adult. He was never a stage dad in any way, but I think that he sort of wanted me to take advantage of the opportunity that I had given my interest in it and everything. So there was never any sort of conflict or like generational challenge. I always just felt really lucky to have him around to talk to about the stuff, and he was always extremely helpful with it. And then as it became time in my development to start, learning on the job, he'd have me sit in on a gig of his, and it would sort of become a little bit of a homework assignment with him as my private teacher. Was I've got this duo gig at this place, and you're going to come and play Joy Spring because that's the tune you're working on.
Yes.
And then it was, we've got a gig at the New Orleans, you're on it. I'll pay you $20. I was like thrilled for that. And now it's come full circle where I'm the one with the gig and I get to call him.
Yeah.
So it was never contentious or competitive. It's always been a very, very good learning experience.
You're the product of maybe more, I don't know, but at least 3 great musical educational institutions. Could you talk a little bit about the high school that you went to?
I'll talk about the high school, but more importantly was the middle school. Seattle has a well-known high school juggernaut going on, a dual and sort of county-wide juggernaut, where Garfield High School and Roosevelt High School are the 2 powerhouses that are sort of leading it, but all the high schools around them have exceptional jazz programs, world-class jazz programs that are continuously coming out to essentially Ellington, which is kind of the high water mark of any jazz competition festival. They're routinely coming out 3 and 4 at a time from the Seattle area in a festival that accepts 15 bands, 3 of them every year from Seattle. What is that? And what it really boils down to is this guy named Robert Nat, who was the band director at Washington Middle School from somewhere in the late 80s up until about maybe 5 years ago. And he's from New Orleans. You want to talk about an impressive program. I started middle school in 1993. And in 1994, we placed second at the Lionel Hampton Jazz Festival. And that was the last time that he did not place first for another 10 years. Everything that they went and competed in, they won for 10 years. Yep. So it wasn't just, we got a good group of kids that year. The dynasty lasted for a decade. And Mr. Nat's ability to inspire and challenge that particular age group of kids was remarkable. And what it meant was that when those kids finished 8th grade and went on to high school, Clarence Acox at Garfield High School and Scott Brown at Roosevelt High School were getting fully formed, ready-to-go 9th graders that could read a part, they could be in a section, they could improvise, they could play a good lead if they needed to play lead. They already knew what to do.
It's very unfamiliar to me, this idea of competitions, and I'm curious about, making music competitive is a very strange feeling to me to do that. It is competitive. I mean, once you get out here, it is competitive. When you show up well-dressed because somebody else is going to get your gig. But it's interesting that you say that. So one of the things that it does achieve, though, is that it actually prepares kids for the next level, and they're very prepared when they go into high school.
When you're 12 or 13 or 14 and you have that competition, it really gives you something to prepare for, and it gives you something to care about even beyond your run-of-the-mill performance. Because you might have a gig, and your parents are going to be there, and your friends are going to be there. But if you have a chance to win something, I think that gives you an even greater sense of urgency towards preparation, towards how serious you take it. It also gives you the really cool experience of traveling somewhere. We would get on a bus and drive to Idaho, and we'd be away for the weekend, and then we'd come back, and you get to brag to your friends that, you were up all night and watched Showtime until 3 a.m.
right.
or whatever. And then because of the level of the bands in Seattle and the pride that Seattle took of those bands, there was actually a little bit of celebrity that went along with it. When I was in 7th grade, there was a feature article on the front page of the Seattle Times about our band.
Mm-hmm.
I had a picture and my name in the paper. And when you're 13, going back to school with that is like, you might as well be the football star. And that lasted through high school, and it still exists for all of... I mean, the New York Times did an article on Seattle high schools a few years back. To have that sort of attention paid to you makes you take it very seriously at that age. And I think that it gives the kids a sense of... a real sense of unity and of pride for the school and for the band.
And do a lot of those kids go on to become professional musicians?
Yeah. I mean, in my high school band, probably half the kids are still playing at a professional level, if not full-time pros. I mean, my high school trumpet section, literally, like, 4 of those guys that I went to high school with were on SNL with Macklemore. I was like, oh yeah, that's O'Rourke, Carter, Nick, and Jason. And they're all full-time professionals. And there was like 6 more trumpet sections that could have gotten the call that could just have gone up and done it too, that also went to Garfield, that also, were within that sort of age spectrum. It's frightening, really. With all honesty, that high school band that I was in was still one of the best bands I've played in.
But you ultimately came to New York.
Yeah, I mean, I moved to New York for school, as did a whole bunch of people. My high school band, it was like, that was the expectation. It was actually kind of weird. I mean, looking back on it, it's not so weird, but it was weird then to see these good players go to school for just like some regular topic. I think it's cliche, but it's cliche for a reason, that the study of music greatly increases your potential in terms of success in life. Because to learn music is so hard and takes so much of you and makes your brain work in so many different ways.
Yeah.
That then, your sort of regular task of getting your PhD doesn't seem so bad. I've been fortunate to basically make my living playing gigs, and at this stage of my life, I'm happy with that.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people who are making their living teaching piano lessons, you know, but they're happy with that too. There's a lot of people who have gone through that experience and are now trying to find the balance of their art versus their craft.
Yeah.
And I've definitely sort of embraced the idea of being a professional craftsman trumpet player.
Yeah.
And finding my artistry within that. Looking for any opportunity, you do the George G. Swing Orchestra and you get your chance to solo, or you get, or the way that you inflect the lead trumpet part, or whatever it is that you can do. It's not always about, here's my gig with my music that no one's going to show up to because it's,
right.
It's on a Tuesday at wherever. But
that's an interesting thing, isn't it? That there's a difference between finding a way to be yourself or bring yourself and your artistry to any gig.
Yeah.
As opposed to, playing the gig that you need to get your friends down to, and it's hard and competitive, and everybody's got a gig like that.
Exactly. And everybody has their Facebook fan page, and everybody's got their website, and everybody's got their CDs, and everybody's got their, self-driven PR e-newsletter. I mean, I have all those things too, but I'm just one of that all that stuff basically equates, here's my business card.
Yes.
Please call me for a gig. And the one thing that I actually really appreciate about the sort of craft angle of things and the sort of journeyman pro angle and the Patience-Higgins angle is that on some level it's a pure meritocracy. Like it's the way in which you can sort of focus on the journey and it will take care of itself. Mm-hmm. Not to get too zen about it, but I just went through this experience today. I had to figure out a sub for a gig. And my thought process was, who do I know that's good enough? Yeah. That was all I cared about. I didn't care about a website.
Right.
I thought, who's going to be the best for dealing with this type of music?
You didn't think about what they might wear?
Well, you always call who you know. There's always going to be that level of politics.
Sure.
And whether or not the politics play out beyond that depends on the person and the gig. I find myself always knowing that the guys that I call are going to be dressed right.
Yeah.
But that is something that I consider. You consider in that call, who's going to be able to deal with that type of music, but are they someone that I can rely on? Can I put my name on their shoulders and say they are representing me on this gig? But that's the professionalism thing. That's the Higginsian, the Patience, the big three from Patience. It's like be on time, be dressed right, know the music.
It's part of, are they good?
Yeah, exactly. It's the overall question. And then the other thing, I think, just to sort of to put a fine point on what we were just talking about, is my dad saying, and I don't know where he got it from, but I'm sure it wasn't original, but he said, always bring the most artistry you can to a professional gig and the most professionalism you can to the artistic gig. Because then, you're always looking for, your opportunity to make the most of your gig. I mean, you can be on your 400th club date with a wedding band and still find something that makes it fun for you. Mm-hmm. And you sort of have to. That's like your survival technique, because you got to pay your rent. That gig pays you some money, and you don't want to go crazy.
Yep.
So what can I bring to this? What can I do to make this fun? Can we make up horn lines? Can I, just where can there be some joy? Where can there be some art in this very stagnant world?
Yep.
And at the same time, when you get called to play at Smalls, man, wear your suit and show up at 8:30, because you don't want the band leader freaking out about where you are.
So speaking of the band leader, you've had some really interesting gigs in the last, 5-8 years. Mm-hmm. What are some of the most influential early bands or gigs that you had that really made an impact for you?
Wow. Interestingly enough, one of the gigs that comes to mind, first of all, is a long stint that I had with a swing band called Double Down. It started just as a bunch of guys that I went to the new school with. The idea was to start a Rat Pack swing band that would, play some money gigs. And it ended up turning into this 7.5-year thing for me. They're still going. I eventually had to just leave the band because of other commitments, but it was kind of my first steady group to play with on a regular basis. And even though in some ways musically it wasn't like what I moved to New York for, it was playing swing charts. We gigged a lot, and it ended up becoming, especially at that period of time where I had just gotten out of school and really was looking for every gig that I could get, it became something I could financially rest my hat on. I ended up eventually meeting my current girlfriend that way, But it taught me a lot about consistency, professionalism, stage presence, and how to do things that were in that professional realm of keeping the gig, getting excitement, getting house on a solo. Like, you've got your 8 bars and you've got to play a high note solo in the third set. How do you deal with those realities of the professional life? So in terms of New York gigs, it wasn't like some big famous person gig. It was just the reality of almost like the day-to-day office job in the musical world. Was like we had gigs every week, and we were working all the time, and we were doing weddings, and we were doing Swing 46. And every one, it was like we had to we memorized all of our music, so there was a process in learning how to do that. And all the skills that I got from that, it was almost like being in a really good minor league gig, because then when I got a major league call, like to play with Richard Bona, those translatable skills of being able to, do the flashy things when you need to do it, having the stage presence to be able to deal with the crowd, memorizing all your parts in a short period of time. I developed all those skills with Double Down. Right. So it was a completely different musical experience, but the underlying professional skills were very similar. So that, surprisingly enough, was one of my big sort of first gigs in a lot of ways. But at the same time, I mean, my first gigs with the Mingus Band was like, wow, okay, here's another level. Getting the opportunities to play with the Jazz Lincoln Center Orchestra, performing with them, those were big things, but they were almost kind of like big, obvious things that you expect to be confronted with. And what I learned from the Double Down gig was the sort of more of the finer details of just being a professional, which I think really helped me when I got to those quote-unquote major league gigs in a way that I didn't expect them to initially.
Do you tend to date people in the music world that you meet through that scene?
Well, I guess so, yes. I've dated people around my social life, although I haven't had... It's been a while since I've dated a musician, and I think it's going to be a while since I date a musician. Yeah. I don't want to spill any beans, but I'm probably off the market in general. I mean, I had a long relationship with a singer, and it posed some challenges. I mean, I didn't see so much of it at the time, but, one of the things that I came to realize is that we were both hustling at the same time, sometimes at the same places with the same people. And just certain little things of like, after we broke up, there were literally people I couldn't call for gigs for a while because they were, because she kept some friends and, things like that. And it wasn't a contentious breakup and it wasn't like a big issue, but having such a close professional and social circle made for some challenges. And the thing that I've really enjoyed about, being with like a quote unquote normal person is that I think it keeps you grounded in a way that being with a musician can not, because if you have two people that live on the fringes of society in this musician world that we have, there's some danger to that. If your partner is always up for being at the hang until 4 a.m, that's not healthy.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So as I progress in adulthood, I become more and more appreciative of the fact that the woman that I live with is waking up in the morning, and I wake up with her, and so I'm awake at 9 o'clock. I'm awake at 8 o'clock.
Yeah.
By and large, I start my day with the rest of the world.
Yes.
Now.
I think that's a big thing about really living in the world and not living on the outside of the world. I know a lot of musicians who live on what you say, on the fringes or on the margin.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
No, that's a thing. That's a pull.
Yeah.
But again, it goes back to this thing that you mentioned before about choosing to be the working, jobbing musician as opposed to the starving artist.
Yeah. And then on the other, the sort of unexpected bonus of this is the reality that for her and her circle of friends, all of her work people and all of the people that she grew up with and her friends from college, I'm the only professional musician they know. So whenever I have a gig, they all show up. Like, I had my CD release party, and it was at Dizzy's, which I was, that was a huge win. I was so happy to be able to get that. And when my girlfriend told her friends that her boyfriend had a show at Dizzy's, it was an opportunity for every single one of them to have date night at a cool club. Mm-hmm. And she brought like 35 people. And they all had jobs to pay the cover, ate dinner, bought wine. And that's an important thing. You have a... And
you didn't have to reciprocate 30 times and go see their gigs.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if your whole social circle is musicians, they're skipping the cover because they either, they already know the club owner and they're coming in anyway. And then they only buy one glass of wine because they don't want to spend $40 at the bar, which is all understandable because they're all on your same financial level. Yeah. And, especially when you're younger and you're not working as much, the last thing you want to do is like spend a bunch of money.
Yeah.
But I've told this to students of mine when they were in high school and they were thinking about college. I said, don't rule out going to a regular school, because if you go to a regular school, you're going to build a different type of social network that's going to be a different type of advantage when you get older.
Yeah, interesting.
And as a fan base, knowing those quote-unquote regular people can be a huge advantage if what you're trying to do is get people to come to your gigs who will spend money. And you're not thinking about that when you're a kid because you're just thinking about getting those gigs, but then you get that gig and you're at Cornelia Street and you bring 5 musicians there and they never call you again because you didn't fill the club with paying customers.
But that's a very strategic, very professional-minded point of view.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking that way when I was a kid.
Right.
I sort of realized that after the fact of like, oh, this is cool. There's, But yeah, it's sort of a very strategic, detailed way of thinking. It's also interesting to be able to talk to people who are not musicians, who are, in the throes of regular life, about what it is that they appreciate about a show or a concert. I'm lucky to have relationships with my girlfriend's friends that they're I can talk to them and be like, so can you just tell me what it was that you did like and what it was that you didn't like, just as a lay observer, because they're not going to sit there and go like, oh man, he totally hit the flat 5 on that major chord, and they don't care about that. What is the visceral experience for them? I've learned that simple things like trading 4s can be much more exciting for someone who's not necessarily in tune to. I mean, it could be obvious, but like people don't necessarily want to hear you stretch. And so, from a presentational aspect, how does that translate to the listener? And that then you're talking about lessons that I've also learned from Richard Bona and stuff like that, where he's like, solos are short. You might have one song where there's a stretch out point, but you don't. It's not this thing of like, oh man, we're all gonna go for it and reach for it and jam. It's like the whole thing is a composition.
Yeah.
The entire performance is a composition. You got to figure out how you're gonna balance all these different things. How you're gonna let somebody be featured but not over featured. How you're gonna, fill up the hour of time of instrumental music that you're presenting and not have everybody fall asleep. And being able to have access to the regular folk, it's a great thing because you can talk to them about that. And they're like, well, I liked it when when you and the tenor player were going back and forth. That was exciting. Okay, great. I'm gonna do more of that. Put that in the next show.
I was curious to ask you if over the years you seem to have had exposure to so many great players coming up through the educational component, but also because you had all musicians coming through your house when you were young. Mm-hmm. If there are any really distinctive or memorable, experiences in terms of trying to find your sound.
The hard bop Art Blakey thing is like that is the root. That's the innermost core of the tree of my musical thing. I mean, anytime I come back to anything, it's that. And even more specifically, it's the album Ugetsu. You know, I mean, that was literally my favorite record when I was 2. I would ask my parents to put that record on.
Yeah.
How many 2-year-olds do that? But I also have certainly dabbled in a lot of different crazy things. When I first finished school, I was coming out of the new school, and I was doing gigs with a bunch of great musicians. You know, Tommy Crane and Travis LaPlante and Colin Killalay and these guys who are still playing and still doing amazing things. And we put together this band that was our senior year combo, and we called it Hexagon. And I booked us a month of gigs at the Poorhouse in Williamsburg, which is, I don't even know if they exist anymore. It was in the back room of the Poorhouse, and we were doing the most structureless free jazz, pure improvised stuff that we could think of. Literally, I had compositions that were like, and I think I just stole this idea from Travis because he was super badass at this stuff. But you'd just be like collections of people and shapes, and you know, like like weird avant-garde stuff. And I think our last gig, and it was our last gig because we didn't even make it through the month. We didn't even have an audience. We had an audient. It was my dad. He came all the way out to Brooklyn to come see the thing. And he was like, well, what'd you think? I was like, I don't know. Thanks for coming.
Yeah.
He's like, I don't know if this is going to really, make it for you.
Yeah.
Did you have fun? Well, it was interesting, So, I mean, I've certainly dabbled in the extreme, and I've also gotten to dabble in the extreme more on a higher level. Like, I got to play in Oliver Lake's big band for a gig. That was, more of a real world experience of that stuff. But I think that my journeys to the esoteric were more of just experimental. You go there and you go, well, okay, I didn't like that.
Yeah.
I should be more fair. I didn't like doing that for myself.
Yeah.
I mean, that all being said, one of my favorite musicians on planet Earth is Peter Evans, and that's where he lives. And I think he's one of the most interesting and creative and mind-blowing trumpet players alive. So, but yeah, I think my journey has sort of just come back to the roots, and if I really am honest with myself about what I love, it's that style of jazz, or things in the sort of Horace Silver post-bop, going towards the Cannonball Adderley, almost acid jazz kind of vibe. I like that stuff. I like black music.
Yeah.
Period. That's my thing.
Have you ever had an experience where you felt any racial tension playing black music?
I mean, I'm aware of the reality of the racial component of the existence, of just being in a world where you, as a white guy who plays music that was invented by black people, I think just that is going to inherently bring up some tension in places. I think also as a part of my upbringing, I was, literally in a house with black musicians all the time. So I was not, in moving to New York and getting involved in, quote unquote, the black scene, if you will. It was never something where I felt discomfort, and it wasn't ever something where I personally felt people vibing me because I was the white guy.
Yeah.
But
the black scene within jazz, you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, but part of that was that my mentor was Patience Higgins, who's an older black guy, and that when I moved to New York, he was bringing me up to Saint Nick's Pub, and I was going to Harlem for these jam sessions and meeting all these black music. My thing.
Have you ever had an experience where you felt any racial tension playing black music?
I mean, I'm aware of the reality.
I mean, I don't want to harp on it too much, but it's interesting.
No, I think it is something to harp on because it's a really important reality to face, and I've been very fortunate to be literally in the car with a point of view on that. Like driving to a gig with Orrin Evans right after Nicholas Payton puts out the BAM thing.
Yeah, right.
I mean, Orrin and Nicholas are close, and so having the experience of kind of being a fly on the wall while that's being talked about, or being out on the road with the Mingus Dynasty, and it's like Frank Lacey and Orrin and Jaleel Shaw and these guys who have a very unique and well-educated perspective on the reality of being a black musician in America playing black music.
Yes. I
got to sit there and really get the shit, and hear what it, hear firsthand accounts, unedited, about what it means. And if nothing else, it means that I have some idea of what it's like for them.
Yeah.
Just from hearing them talk about it.
And what is that?
I think that I don't know if I can really speak to that so much, but I think more that in terms of my recognition of issues and my recognition of the reality of what other people might face, and then as my own perspective of being one of the white guys in the black band, I think that I can exist in that world with a respectful understanding of what other people are feeling and thinking. You know, I don't think I'll ever pretend to be an authority on it or to ignore that it exists. You know, but. Yeah,
yeah.
I don't know if that's an answer.
No, that's a great answer, and I thank you for answering it in that way, because it's touchy, and there are more white people playing black music, or what was black music, than there are black people playing it today.
Yeah, and you know what? That it's not just jazz; it's every black music that has ever been invented.
Yes,
there's sort of this very predictable arc where, like, somewhere in black culture, a new music is invented, and all of America goes crazy for it, and then
all the world
goes crazy for it, and then the history of black music seems to always be progressing, and then followed up by white people that are taking it up. I mean, look at rock and roll now. Remember, rock and roll is black music.
Yeah.
30 years from now, people might forget that hip hop is black music.
Yeah.
And so that's just sort of the progression of things, and for whatever reason that is. I think within the jazz world, especially with the artistic jazz world, you see a lot of black artists who are older who probably are lamenting the idea that their music is being lost outside of its original culture. And I think you see, one of the interesting things is that you see within bands led by black leaders, you see the ongoing tradition of hiring younger musicians, right? And I was just talking about this with someone when I got to sit in on Roy Hargrove's gig. And Roy Hargrove was a young black artist who was hired by older people and played with older cats, and then as he became older, hired younger cats.
Yep.
And you see that throughout the tradition of the black jazz experience, is that, we need a young guy in the band. Art Blakey made his whole career for 40 years of young guys.
Absolutely.
And you don't see that in the white experience. In the white musician bands, by and large, you see guys hiring within their own social circle, and they hire the guys that they grew up with that are their age. And as they get older, you don't necessarily see them making a point to pull young people in. Whereas you can go through the list of every band. You look at Roy Hargrove, his rhythm section is young guys. You look at Terrence Blanchard, his rhythm section is young guys. You look at Wynton Marsalis, he's always going after young guys, particularly in the piano chair specifically.
Yep.
But Orrin Evans, young guys in his band, and on and on and on it goes. Nicholas Payton, young guys in his band. Because you don't see that as much in the white culture, I think you see this thing where young white musicians might be feeling like they're not getting calls because they're the white guy.
Yeah.
And while that might be true, it's true for the wrong reason that they think. If you do see a preferential treatment for black guys in black bands over white guys in white bands, I think it stems from the fact that you've got so many white musicians now that if you're an older black musician, you kind of want to keep it in the family. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. That's a natural thing of, like, here's a community, a culture of musicians that want to keep their own heritage involved in the progression of the music. And within that tradition is something that's more specific to the black American culture than the white American culture. But then on the other hand, you've got those same musicians who deal with a white power structure around their music, and and white reviewers who are, so yeah, it's a complicated issue, certainly. But
it is. Yeah. Well, and you obviously are familiar with it and have thought about it a lot and understand it and understand how nuanced it is. I mean, I think another part of it is audience.
Sure.
One of the things that did happen is that the context around the music that helped it develop is no longer the same context. Yeah. So the context that sort of created the music initially was a popular context.
Sure.
And that the black audience is not necessarily always there for jazz anymore either.
It's smaller, and that, again, this was something in my lucky little fly on the wall moments where, this is a conversation that was coming up. And I know that Orrin has been, I don't want to speak too publicly for him, but I know that he has been publicly vocal about this, that I think he really laments that there's a dying black audience, particularly a young black audience. You go to Philly and you play at Chris's, and the young audience that's there is white, and the black audience that is there is older. It's middle-aged now. The young black people who are interested in the music are the musicians.
Yeah.
You don't really see much of a young black audience. And the young people who are going to check it out are the young, predominantly white college kids who are also musicians, but they're predominantly white. And that's just what you see when you go to the clubs. And then also, depending on where you go, the makeup of the audience is, you see a lot of older white people, checking out the music. I know that, that's just that's something that it's an understandable complaint and concern, especially if you're a black guy who's playing black music and you're wondering where are all the black people, you know.
Well, I dig the fact that you're just aware of what an audience wants, that you're tuned in regardless of race to what draws an audience in. I think that's, to get back to that a little bit, the fact that you would ask your girlfriend's friends, what do you like about the show?
I mean, for me, any information is good information, you know. I certainly know plenty of people that are like, man, fuck that, you know, I'm doing my thing. Yeah. And, okay, that's cool, but, you know, there's nothing wrong with getting a little information about what parts of your thing really aren't working. Yeah. You know, I just saw this interesting documentary about El Bulli, the Spanish restaurant. And, what's his name, Ferran Adrià? Yeah. At the very end of the documentary, the whole thing was just sort of following him in the creation of a menu. They take 6 months off, and they create a whole new menu of stuff that they've never done before, that nobody's ever done before. And it's this deeply personal artistic process for them. But at the end of the thing, at the end of the documentary, somebody's talking about some new dish that was getting complaints. And, you know, Andrea is like, well, you know, at the end of the day, they're the ones paying for it, so we got to respect what they think. Sure. And no matter how much artistry and passion and love you put into the whatever it is that you made, if nobody likes it and you're trying to sell it to people, well, you got to sort of come to terms with that. Either you don't sell it to them or you change what you're selling. Yeah. And I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with, you know, trying to develop an honest assessment of what it is that you're presenting. And ultimately what we're presenting as musicians is a form of entertainment. And to just gauge how entertaining it might be to a person who paid cover charge to come see you. You know, they decided they're not going to catch up on Netflix. You know,
that's right. They're not staying home watching TV.
They're not staying home. They've come out. They've bought a cab or they've taken the train. They've, you know, put on a tie. They're there. They're trying to impress somebody. They've spent money to spend time with you to put on a show. Yeah. And I think you have to be respectful of that. You know, I think if you're not respectful of that, you're missing something big. Yeah, really big. I mean, if it's not considering the audience, then you're just masturbating.
That's right, know?
Like,
in public.
In public.
Do you have a sense of where you want to go?
I think I'm in the process of figuring that out. I had very specific goals. Like, if you would ask me that 5 years ago, I would have told you, well, I want to, you know, I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to do this kind of touring, and I want to be able to be on this thing, and I want to, you know, I want to have my blah, 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 and I want to do this. And I actually kind of got to do all those things. Like, I had my checklist of shit I wanted to accomplish in New York. Yeah. And my, you know, I want to either do it by 10 years or by the time I'm 30. And I kind of got in under the wire for all of them. Yeah. You know? I wouldn't mind doing a couple gigs with Maria Schneider's band. You know, I've played, I did a rehearsal, I subbed for Ingrid one time, and she actually came to Juilliard when I was there and did a residency, and we played all of her music. And that was great. And I've got a very strong appreciation for her writing. And, you know, that's just a gig I'd love to do just sort of as a, you know, as a jazz guy. And, you know, other things like it'd be nice to have my own Broadway show, you know, just to have that experience of being the guy who makes the calls as opposed to the guy who's trying to get the calls.
To have the chair in a show.
Yeah, to have the chair in the show. I feel like there's a certain comfort in that I'd like to experience. There's also a certain discomfort in that, I'm sure. But I'm honestly, I'm trying to figure out what that big next step might be. I'm kind of enjoying this right now while I still have the legs to enjoy it. I don't see myself as necessarily wanting to be, you know, 30 years from now in my late 50s and 60s trying to do the grind of the gigs. And I certainly enjoy teaching. I mean, I'm literally going to a lesson right after we finish this interview. And I've had the opportunity to teach in classroom stuff and do workshops, and I really enjoy that, and I want that to be a part of my career. But that in and of itself is a certain retirement because I really respect the teachers who are just teachers. Mm-hmm. You know, it's kind of, you know, it's almost like getting married versus dating. Like you got to be you got to be ready to settle down into that gig, and you got to be willing, especially as a trumpet player, to accept that if you want to be a great teacher, if you want to really be committed to your students, to your work, you know, to your institution and stuff, you kind of got to give up the performance thing as you can't really do both. There's some people who maintain that, but I've
because
seen
physically you can't keep up your chops.
Yeah, specifically as a trumpet player. But you know, you also see a lot of people who teach who aren't really that great at teaching. They might be great performers, but they're not really great teachers.
But they want a gig.
But they want the gig, and somebody offers them the money, and it's, you know, steady bread, and, you know, it gives them a cachet of now I teach at such and such, and you see a lot of people who suffer because they in that area because they're not really I don't want to be one of those people.
Yeah.
If I'm going to teach, I want to teach, and if I'm going to play, I want to play. And so maybe down the road, that's something I want to look into. But at the same time, man, nowadays you need your PhD to get those gigs, or
true.
you need to be famous, which doesn't necessarily make you a great teacher.
Right.
So I don't know. Right now, I'm happy to have gigs, to be working and paying my rent with that. It's a pretty amazing thing.
Well, congratulations. That's a wonderful thing to be able to say you're happy and you're satisfied with where you are. And thanks so much for talking to me.
Man, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.